Something happened to me about 7 or 8 years ago that dramatically changed the course of my life. I was working for the Human Rights Campaign at the time, and I walked out of my office, and I was approached by somebody on the street who had a nice little clipboard. He was very young and earnest, and he said, "Excuse me, do you care about the environment?" And the truth was, I didn't think much about it. I was not an environmentalist. I was a working mom. I was focused on my kids, and I was focused on gay rights because I thought that work was what would was the best that I could do to help ensure a better world, a safer world for my family. So I said what we say in these situations. I said, "Sorry, I don't have the time." And I kept moving on. I was on my way to pick up my son from school. The next day, however, I walked out of my office again, and there was the same young man with the same clipboard and the same question. "Excuse me, do you care about the environment?" "Sorry," I said a little more quickly this time. On the third day, you know what's happening now. I just kind of barely looked up as I said, "Sorry," and went on my way. But actually, it was too late, because this was the time of an inconvenient truth. This was the time of front-page headlines all of a sudden about climate change. One of them, a little prematurely, in USA Today, read then, "The debate is over, the world is warming." Climate change, in other words, was in the air. I wasn't focused on it at all. It was not my world, but it was in the air. And this young man's question in that particular context stopped me in my tracks. So I started thinking about it and studying it and worrying. And I felt really increasingly uncomfortable with what I was learning. But I also thought, well, what can I do? I had 2 young kids and a full-time job. So I arrived home one day, and I was with my son, and I flipped on Bob the Builder for him. And then I walked into the kitchen to get a snack, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught this photo. And this is a photo of my son. He was a kindergartner at the time. And there he is, you know, he's just walking down a dirt road, right? Curious, carefree, out to explore the world like any kid. And all of a sudden, in that moment, when I looked at that photo, I got it. And I thought that to meticulously care for my children at home, as I had been doing, to care about their every little bump in self-esteem, every scraped knee, to care about whether they might hear some prejudicial word someday about their mom. To do all of that and yet not concern myself about the world that they were going to go into was simply missing the big picture entirely. So I quit working in gay rights, and I became an environmentalist. I took a position with the Center for Eco-Literacy, which is a small nonprofit focused on education for sustainable living. I co-authored a book with Daniel Goleman, the psychologist, who I believe has been here before. And that book just came out last year. It's on linking emotional, social, and ecological intelligence as a way to try to make it more effective. It's called Eco-Literate. And I'm now working on a book for parents about what climate change has to do with our kids and what our response to it might be. So I'm interested in reaching beyond the choir in this way, because I'm interested in reaching parents and anyone else who is the sort of person who probably would never walk in this room, because I'm part of that rather large camp that believes that our special interest-driven politics demands it. It demands that we have the expression of public will. And to have that expression of public will, we need a real, genuine movement. As Theda Skopel of Harvard University wrote recently, to counter the fierce political opposition, and of course here she's talking about opposition to climate action in Congress, to counter fierce political opposition, insider politics cannot carry the day on its own apart from a broader movement pressing politicians for change. So to effect that radical, urgent change that we need, I believe that it's abundantly clear we need to be focused on engaging the public. We need a movement. We need a broadly based, wildly successful movement. And with all due respect to Bill McKibben and to everybody else who works very hard on this issue, we are now nowhere near having that kind of wildly successful movement. A movement, say, as wildly successful as the gay and lesbian rights movement was. The most successful social movement in recent American history. In only the past few decades, if you think about it, the gay and lesbian movement has radically changed life for gay and lesbian Americans, for their families, for this entire country. In my lifetime, it's gone from one in which we were considered mentally ill, immoral, and a national security risk, to one in which we can now serve in the US military, petition to adopt children in 50 states, and of course, have the right to marry now be heard in front of the US Supreme Court in just a very short period of time. This movement has inspired changes that have swept popular culture, the law, religion, healthcare, sports, family life, and so on. So how was it so successful, and what lessons might we learn from it? I do believe there are lessons to learn, but first let me acknowledge a few differences, or at least some perceptions of differences between the movements. The gay movement in general is seen as concerning an issue that is deeply personal. Climate change, in contrast, is seen as focused on an issue that's global, that's ecological, that's mind-boggling complex, that's at the very opposite end of the spectrum of something deeply personal. The gay rights movement was seen as something that was in the now. The fight was about the right to marry now, the right to have children now, the right to visit a partner in the hospital now. Climate change, of course, is perceived as something in the future, which raises a host of psychological and communication challenges. And finally, the gay rights movement was focused on one clear demand. I would venture to say you could say what it is. Equality, very clear. Climate change? Well, we don't exactly have one clear demand. As Wade said yesterday, we must change the fundamental ways we inhabit the planet. That's what this battle is about. So instead of one clear demand, we're after changing everything. I'm going to return to these, but let's turn now to some of the similarities in how people respond to these issues and how they respond to gay issues and climate change. And when I think about this, I should say that I'm thinking on the gay spectrum here of about roughly 20 years ago, 15 years ago, in the midst of the struggle, not at the much more successful point now. So contrasting that to climate change in the moment. So some similarities. How people respond to gay rights very often involves denial. In the individual who's going through a self-awareness experience, denial is often one of the first things that happens. It did for me. It did for just about everybody else I know. It's a frightening thing, so it starts with denial. There's also often denial from others who don't really want to accept it. So climate change, well, I don't think I have to say anything about that one. Another similarity, fear. In the gay rights movement, there was unquestionably fear for everybody who was involved in it. There's fear about what it means for one's own life. There's fear for how others would respond. There's fear just from having to step out of a comfort zone. With climate change, I mean, many people have argued that at the heart of it, there's a tremendous fear. Wow, 5 minutes. There's a tremendous fear that hasn't really been talked about very much. That climate change for many people represents the big fear, the fear of death. There's also just a fear of talking about it. Another similarity in gay rights movement, there was a debate about nature. Is sexual orientation natural or is it not natural? I wonder if we've ever heard that one. In the gay rights movement, there was the dynamic of shaming and stereotyping. Faggot, queer, dyke, worse, very powerful words used. Also a focus on extremes, which is an incredibly powerful way to create an us and them, to put things at a distance. With climate change, I would say we see some of the same thing. You know, we certainly see the notion of doomers and gloomers, right? This morning I heard another one that was new to me, the evil green dragon, you know? These, and certainly the stereotyping. So these are words and techniques that prove to alienate. Final similarity, not the final, but a final, is something that flows from it, a silencing. There was a silencing in the gay rights movement, people being in the closet, people hiding their very core identity. What do you think about climate change? I mean, we've heard a lot, especially over the last presidential campaign, about the silence in politics. There's also a silence in everyday life. I have to speed up a little bit here. So in the face of these similar dynamics, what did the gay rights movement do? How did they look at their own behavior and their own words to change this dynamic so unbelievably successfully? Number one, they encouraged people to come out, which means simply, of course, talk about it, right? When I worked at the Human Rights Campaign overseeing the National Coming Out Project, I can tell you that encouraging people to talk about it didn't mean simply, hey, go talk about it. It meant, I'm going to help you figure out how to talk about it. I'm going to talk to you about how you can talk about it in an African-American community, in a Latino-Latina community. I'm going to tell you how you can talk about it in a religious community, in healthcare. I'm going to tell you what to anticipate in how people respond to it and how to prepare yourself for that conversation. That's something I think we can do. Another strategy, and I believe potential lesson learned, tremendous focus on cultivating community in the gay rights movement, because in a situation that is challenging, we need each other. Number three, as I said, there was a simple message, equality across the board. Another strategy and potential lesson here, the gay rights movement focused on telling both personal and inclusive stories. It wasn't just about those gay people. It was about those gay people in families, in relationship, so that everybody could be a part of this story. I think we have the potential to do that. The gay rights movement deliberately focused on shattering stereotypes, seeking out the people who broke the mold so that other people could relate to them. Because seeing somebody who you can relate to, whether it's somebody who's gay or whether it's somebody who's speaking about the climate issue, is very important. Another is that there was a focus on deeply human, heartfelt values: love, equality, acceptance, freedom, family, work. This was not heady stuff, you know, this was heartfelt stuff, and that's what moved people. And finally, the gay rights movement stayed positive. There was a focus on the problem, but there was always a focus on the possibility. It was celebratory, it was pride, there was a sense of being on the right side of history. We have that. We have all of that. So I would propose that these are some of the possible lessons learned from the gay rights movement. But just to wrap it up in a way that might be a little simpler to remember, remember the slide about differences between the two movements? There were 3 differences. I propose that perhaps those perceived differences are not just perceived differences. There are challenges. They're what we need to focus on. It is a deeply personal issue. It doesn't get any more personal. There is a focus on the now. We need action now. And there is possibly one clear demand, and this is what I would love to hear people talk a little bit about. But one thing to consider is that perhaps, just like the gay rights movement, the black civil rights movement, the women's movement, and everyone else in recent time I can think of, there is an equality issue here. And that equality issue is the equal right of every future generation to enjoy the abundance of the healthy planet that we have, and the equal responsibility of every one of us to ensure that they do. Thank you.